Flight Lieutenant Roger Hobbs pushed the throttles of his Gloucester Javelin FAW.9 forward at 0214 on September 9th, 1959, climbing out of RAF Akrotiri into a black Mediterranean sky. Ground control at Cape Garter had a fast, unidentified contact bleeding south from the Turkish coast, and the Javelin's airborne interception Mark 17 radar was already sweeping ahead of him. His navigator, Flying Officer Peter Lindsay, called the lock at 18 miles. The target was flying at 43,000 feet, faster than any commercial airframe had business flying, and it was not squawking. Whitehall would later describe the intercept in a Joint Intelligence Committee circulation dated September 15th as conducted with commendable discipline. The aircraft turned north before Hobbs closed to fire-streak parameters. Nobody in the Air Ministry doubted what it had been. The Javelin was not glamorous. It was a heavy, delta-winged, twin-engined, all-weather fighter designed to a 1947 requirement, F.44/46, and it had entered squadron service with 46th Squadron at RAF Odiham in February 1956. The American press preferred the F-104 Starfighter and the F-106 Delta Dart. Fighter Command's own pilots called the Javelin the Flat Iron and complained about its handling above Mach 0.93. Yet the men who feared it most were not writing for aviation magazines. They were flying Ilyushin My-L-28s and Tupolev Tu-16s out of bases at Priluki, Engels and Mary, and they were briefed in cockpit orders their crews later described to Western debriefers after 1991 that the RAF's night-capable Delta was the one Western interceptor most likely to reach them before they could turn. The reason lay in a decision taken inside the Ministry of Supply and the Air Staff between 1949 and 1951, when the Cabinet Defence Committee, chaired by Clement Attlee, accepted that Britain could not match the United States in day fighter numbers and must instead specialise. American doctrine, driven by Strategic Air Command and its interceptor arm, ADC, prioritised supersonic dash and rocket armament. British doctrine, shaped by the JIC's 1950 assessment, JIC 59 on Soviet long-range aviation, prioritised something else entirely: the ability to find, identify and destroy a subsonic bomber at night, in cloud at extreme range from base, using guided weapons. The Javelin was built for that single problem. It carried 4 30mm Aden cannon and, from Mark 7 onward, 4 de Havilland fire-streak infrared missiles. It could loiter, it could fight in weather that grounded the Americans' F-102s at Wheelus and Bitburg. By 1960, Javelins were flying nightly from Akrotiri in Cyprus, Nicosia Detachment, Butterworth in Malaya, Geilenkirchen and Brüggen in RAF Germany, and Luschar's, Waterbeach and Leckenfield at home. 22 squadrons operated the type at its peak, their tasking coordinated by 11 Group at RAF Bentley Priory and by NATO's 2nd Allied Tactical Air Force, was to shut the northern approaches to Britain and the southern flank of the alliance against exactly the aircraft the Soviet 50th Air Army was training to send. The Air Ministry file AIR20/11373, released to the National Archives at Kew in 2004, records 17 positive nocturnal identifications of Soviet bloc aircraft by Javelin crews between April 1958 and December 1961. None became public at the time. What the Soviets feared then was not the airframe itself. It was a doctrine hammered out in Whitehall in the years after Hiroshima that treated the night sky over Europe as British property. That doctrine had a paper trail. It began in a room in the old Air Ministry building in King Charles Street. 3 years before the Javelin flew, the room was 217 King Charles Street, and the meeting was of the Operational Requirements Committee on January 24, 1947. Air Vice Marshal William Elliott chaired. The minute-taker, a civilian named E.C. Cornford, produced a 2-page summary that survives in AVIA 65/821. The committee accepted a paper drafted by the Deputy Chief of the Air Staff, Air Marshal Sir James Robb, arguing that the next Soviet strategic threat would be a jet-powered medium bomber capable of night penetration at 40,000 feet, and that no existing British fighter, including the Meteor NF.11 then in development, could reach it. Robb wanted a new aircraft, twin-engined, radar-equipped, capable of 2 hours on station at long range. Specification F.44/46 was issued to industry 6 months later. Gloucester's design team at Hucklecote, led by Richard Walker, produced the answer. The prototype WD-804 first flew from Moreton Valence on November 26, 1951, with Bill Waterton at the controls. Waterton lost the elevators on a test flight in June 1952 and landed the aircraft with only trim tabs. The George Medal followed. Development was slow, expensive, and by the standards of the day, chaotic. Between 1951 and 1955, the programme absorbed £47 million in direct costs, a figure Chancellor Rab Butler raised in Cabinet on March 8, 1955 as not a matter for congratulation. Yet by then the strategic logic had hardened. The Soviets had detonated their first fusion device on August 12, 1953 at Semipalatinsk. Two 16 Badgers were entering service with the 185th Guards Heavy Bomber Aviation Regiment at Poltava. The JIC's revised assessment, JIC 5432, put Soviet long-range bomber strength at 1,200 airframes by 1958. The Air Council concluded on October 14, 1954, that the Javelin, whatever its faults, had to be produced in numbers. Production ran at Hucklecote and, under a subcontract that infuriated the Gloucester shop stewards, at Armstrong Whitworth's Baginton Works in Coventry. The first operational aircraft went to 46th Squadron at Odiham. By 1959, Marks 1 through 9 had entered service, each with incremental improvements to radar, power plant and weapons. The Mark 9, powered by two Bristol Siddeley Sapphire SA.7R engines with reheat and armed with Firestreak, was the version that mattered. Reheat gave the Javelin the climb performance to reach a target flying at 45,000 feet within 8 minutes of a scramble order. Firestreak, developed at de Havilland Propellers Hatfield plant under Project Blue Jay, was Britain's first operational guided air-to-air weapon, and until Red Top in 1964, the most sensitive infrared seeker in NATO service. The men who flew it came disproportionately from Fighter Command's night fighter tradition. Squadron leader John Cunningham's wartime Mosquito veterans had trained the first Javelin instructors at the Central Fighter Establishment at West Raynham. Their doctrine was clean. Get behind the bomber, use the radar to close inside 2 miles, shoot from a stern quarter, break away before the target's tail gunner had a track. It was the doctrine that had killed Heinkel's over Kent in 1941. Applied to the Tu-16 in 1959, it worked. By the summer of 1960, Javelin squadrons were the backbone of Britain's night air defence, and the aircraft's reputation had begun to travel eastward through channels the air staff neither controlled nor entirely understood. A GCHQ intercept from July 1960, released in redacted form in 2018 as HW80/9, recorded a Soviet air defence controller at Baku warning a training flight to avoid the sector where the British night fighter is on patrol. The controller used the NATO reporting name. He had been briefed to. GCHQ's Cheltenham station had been reading Soviet long-range aviation traffic since 1953, when the joint UK-US Venona successor programme, codenamed Bourbon in Whitehall documents, extended into VHF air defence networks. The material sat with J Division under Josh Cooper, later Clive Lonis. What it revealed across the second half of the 1950s was that Soviet bomber crews were being drilled specifically against the RAF's night defence pattern rather than the USAF's day interception model. The reason was geographic. Any Tu-16 mission against Britain or against NATO's Mediterranean bases would fly through airspace patrolled at night by Javelins operating from Akrotiri, Nicosia, Malta, or the German airfields. The Americans were a daylight problem. The British were the darkness problem. Sir Dick White, appointed Chief of the Secret Intelligence Service on July 1, 1956, had inherited a service still bleeding from the Crab affair 4 months earlier. He wanted human confirmation of what GCHQ was reading. His head of station in Vienna, John Bruce Lockhart, ran an agent inside the Soviet embassy's air attaché office throughout 1957 and 1958, who provided extracts from the manual VVS-58-P-3, Tactics of Long-Range Aviation Against Western Air Defense. The manual named the Javelin. It devoted 3 pages to it. It did not name any American type at comparable length. The extracts translated at Century House went to the JIC on April 22, 1958 as JIC 5825. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan read the assessment at Admiralty House. His private secretary Philip de Zulueta recorded in a note now at PREM 11/2-611 that Macmillan asked whether we are in fact giving the Russians something they take seriously. The Chief of the Air Staff, Sir Dermot Boyle, replied in writing the following week that the Javelin force represented the most effective single deterrent to Soviet night penetration currently deployed in the European theatre. Boyle was professionally incapable of understatement, but the JIC's next quarterly review broadly agreed. The mechanism by which Soviet crews came to fear the aircraft was not, however, only tactical. It was industrial and infrastructural. A Javelin squadron represented a system: 16 aircraft, Type 80 or later Type 84 ground radar, at Neatishead or Trimingham, secure ground-to-air voice channels operated by 90 Signals Unit, and a command and reporting network that had been refined during Exercise Prospect in 1953, and again during Exercise Sunbeam in 1957. Soviet intelligence working through the GRU Residentura in London under Colonel Nikolai Karpikov from 1957 to 1961 understood this. Karpikov's tasking priorities, later described in the Mitrokhin archive material deposited at Churchill College, Cambridge, placed acquisition of Javelin radar performance data in the top tier alongside Bluestreak and V-Force refueling procedures. The GRU never got the radar data in useful form. What it got through the naval spy ring at Portland in 1961 was peripheral. Harry Houghton and Ethel G. at the Admiralty Underwater Weapons Establishment could not reach Air Ministry files. Gordon Lonsdale's network was rolled up on January 7, 1961, after a tip from Michał Goleniewski, a Polish intelligence officer who had walked into the American embassy in Bern and been shared reluctantly with MI5. The Portland trial at the Old Bailey opened on March 13th. Lonsdale drew 25 years. For the air staff, the collapse of the Portland ring was a warning rather than a reassurance. If the GRU was trying that hard for underwater weapons data, it was trying harder still for what protected Britain's skies. The Javelin's edge was, in Whitehall's phrase, a wasting asset. In October 1961, planning began for its replacement. The replacement was already flying. English Electric's P.1B, developed at Wharton under WEW. Petter and then Freddie Page had first flown supersonic on April 11th, 1957, with Roland Beaumont at the controls. Entering service as the Lightning F-1 with 74 Squadron at Coltishall on June 29, 1960, it offered a rate of climb the Javelin could not approach, 20,000 feet per minute against the Javelin's 7,000. Yet the air staff did not simply retire the older aircraft. From 1961 to 1967, Javelins and Lightnings flew a mixed defense, Lightnings for the high-speed dash interception, Javelins for the long endurance night, and all-weather patrol. The doctrine that had defined the Javelin's design survived it. The Cuban crisis in October 1962 tested that doctrine at a level of intensity nobody involved forgot. On October 22, 1962, at 1900 London time, the Chief of the Air Staff, Sir Thomas Pike, ordered Bomber Command and Fighter Command to alert Condition 3. Kennedy's speech, timed for 200 hours Greenwich Mean Time, the following morning, would announce the naval quarantine. Pike's order, held at AIR 8/2 354, brought 48 Javelins to 15-minute readiness across Britain, Cyprus and Germany. At Akrotiri, 29 Squadron's Wing Commander David Bluck walked to the flight line dispersal hut at 0320 on October 23rd in a shirt still damp from the Cyprus night, and briefed his pilots that they were expected to intercept, identify and, if ordered, engage any Soviet aircraft transiting the eastern Mediterranean toward the Turkish or Iranian coast. The Javelins flew for 13 consecutive nights. Nothing crossed their radar. The Soviet 24th Air Army, based in the Transcaucasus, had received a stand-down order from Marshal Vershinin on October 24th, a fact only established from Soviet archival material after 1992. The airborne quarantine, so far as Whitehall could tell at the time, was working. Macmillan, in his diary entry for October 27th, wrote that the RAF in Cyprus and Germany has behaved in a manner that would satisfy Trenchard himself. He was writing for posterity and knew it. Yet the operational reality behind the diary was that Britain had held a sector of NATO airspace at night with an aircraft that the Americans by then considered obsolete. The disparity mattered because the American defense establishment, under Robert McNamara at the Pentagon, was pressing NATO allies towards standardized equipment. McNamara's speech at Ann Arbor on June 16, 1962, had already signalled displeasure with independent nuclear forces. The Skybolt cancellation, announced on December 11, 1962, would provoke the Nassau Summit and Polaris. Beneath these headlines ran a quieter argument about conventional air power. The air staff, briefed by Sir Charles Elworthy after Pike's retirement in September 1963, resisted American pressure to accelerate Javelin withdrawal in favour of the F-4 Phantom. The argument was won temporarily on the grounds that the Javelin's endurance and weapons fit remained better suited to the specific problem of night interception at extreme range. That argument had a shelf life. Firestreak was becoming obsolete against the newer Tu-22 blinder, which entered Soviet service in 1962. And was capable of supersonic dash at altitudes the Javelin could barely reach. The JIC in JIC 6341 warned that the current all-weather fighter, whilst effective against the Tu-16, is unlikely to remain so against successor types beyond 1967. The clock was running. The last frontline Javelin Squadron, 60 Squadron, at RAF Tengar in Singapore, would fly the type until 1968. What replaced it and how was decided in a Whitehall, no longer certain that Britain could afford to defend the whole map. Duncan Sandys had already tried to end the argument. His white paper of April 4, 1957 command. 124 had proposed that manned fighters were obsolescent and that ground-launched missiles, principally the Bristol Bloodhound, would take over air defence. The Javelin survived Sandys because the air staff, led by Boyle and then Pike, argued successfully that missile belts could not identify, only destroy, and that a nuclear-armed alliance needed an identification capability. Sandys' successor at Defence, Harold Watkinson, accepted the argument in June 1959. Yet the political framing set by Sandys that Britain was buying too much of the wrong sort of air power persisted into the 1960s and reshaped how the Javelin story ended. Dennis Healey, appointed Secretary of State for Defence on October 18, 1964, inherited an air force still operating 3 separate all-weather fighter fleets, Javelin, Lightning and, from the Fleet Air Arm, Sea Vixen. Healey's Defence Review of February 1966 command. 2901 cancelled the P.1154 supersonic V/STOL fighter, cancelled the HS.681 transport, and announced the withdrawal from most east of Suez commitments by 1971. The Javelin, tied intimately to those commitments, was scheduled out. 64 Squadron at Tenga, 60 Squadron alongside it, and the Akrotiri detachments would run down between 1966 and 1968. What the Healy Review did not do was end the doctrine the Javelin had embodied. The Phantom FGR.2, which entered RAF service with 6th Squadron at Coningsby in 1969, inherited the night and all-weather role. The Air Staff requirement ASR.395, which produced the eventual Tornado F.3, described its function in language recognizably descended from F.44/46. Long-range identification and engagement of subsonic and supersonic bombers at extreme range from base, particularly on the northern flank against Soviet long-range aviation transiting the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap. The GI-UK gap, a term coined by American analysts in the 1950s, had become by 1970 the operational obsession of Coastal Command's successor, 18 Group at RAF Northwood. The Soviets, meanwhile, had adjusted. From 1962 onward, the 50th Air Army's exercises simulated attacks against a defended northern approach, in which the primary threat was assumed to be RAF night fighters operating from Luchars and, later, Binbrook. Colonel General Reshetnikov, commanding long-range aviation from 1969, later told the historian John Erickson at a Moscow seminar in 1990 that his crews had trained not against the American continental defense system, which we understood, but against the British system, which was harder to model. The remark reported in Erickson's papers at Edinburgh University Library is one of the few direct Soviet acknowledgements of the point. Why the British system was harder to model came down to 3 factors. First, dispersal. Our AF Strike Command, formed on April 30th, 1968 under Sir Wallace Kyle, operated its interceptors from a network of 8 main airfields, plus dispersal sites at Sumburg, Stornoway, and Makryhanish that could be activated within hours. Second, integration. The ground-controlled interception network, upgraded through the Linesman/Mediator program from 1961 to 1974, tied fighter radars, ground radars, and voice channels into a single air picture available to a controller at High Wycombe. Third, and most opaquely, GCHQ. SIGINT from Cheltenham fed the air picture with warning of Soviet aircraft movements before they crossed the northern radar horizon. That last factor, the one Reshetnikov could not model, was also the one Whitehall guarded most carefully. It had a name inside the JIC, though the name itself remains redacted in the released files. What it meant in practice was that a Soviet bomber pilot flying out of Olenia on the Kola Peninsula could be tracked before he knew he was being tracked. And by the time the RAF's fighter reached him, the interception had already been rehearsed on paper at Bentley Priory 10 hours earlier. The rehearsal had a physical location. RAF Bentley Priory, on the northern edge of London, housed the headquarters of Fighter Command until 1968, and then of 11 Group under Strike Command. In the operations room, a wooden gallery looked down on a plotting table that, in the 1960s and 1970s, carried an air picture updated in real time from the radar chain at Buchan, Saxavord, Bulmer, and Neatishead. Above the plotting table hung a clock with red, yellow, and green sectors, a wartime device retained for continuity. Beneath the gallery worked the fighter controllers, junior officers with headsets, speaking to Javelin, Lightning, and later Phantom crews in a code sparse enough to fit inside the 2 seconds a pilot could spare between maneuvers. The system had been designed in essence by Sir Hugh Dowding in 1937. Its Cold War evolution was managed by men who had served under him: Sir Thomas Pike, Sir Dermot Boyle, Sir Hector MacGregor. What they preserved was not the technology, which changed every few years, but the discipline. A single controller responsible for a single interception, a single pilot responsible for the shot. American controllers in the ADC system centered on Colorado Springs worked at higher volume but lower resolution. The British system was designed to kill one bomber cleanly at night at extreme range. It was designed for the problem it had. That design showed under stress. On the night of April 9, 1970, a Soviet Tu-95 Bear D, flying from Olenia on a maritime reconnaissance mission, penetrated the Northern Air Defense Identification Zone at 51,000 feet. 2 Lightnings from 11 Squadron at Luchars intercepted at 0347. The Bear's crew photographed the Lightnings photographed the Bear, and the aircraft parted company over the Faroes Gap. It was a routine encounter, one of what became by the mid-1970s several dozen a year. The routine itself was the achievement. Behind each intercept lay the doctrine hammered out in the Javelin years. Identify, close, be ready to kill, break away. By 1975, the frequency of Soviet probes had risen to the point that Strike Command was flying interceptor missions on an average of 4.7 nights per week from Luchas alone. Air Marshal Sir Dennis Smallwood, C&C Strike Command from 1974 to 1976, described the pattern in evidence to the House of Commons Expenditure Committee on March 3, 1975. Smallwood said that the RAF was maintaining an interception capability of a kind and at a frequency that no other European Air Force approaches. He was characteristically blunt. He was also correct. The strain, however, was showing. The Phantom fleet, purchased in 1965 as an interim solution, was aging. The Tornado F.2 and F.3, developed under the Panavia program with West Germany and Italy from 1968 onward, was not scheduled to enter service until 1984. Between 1975 and 1984 lay a decade in which Britain's air defence would depend on Phantoms, and from 1976 a small number of Lightning F-6s retained at Binbrook past their planned retirement. In Whitehall, the term used in JIC papers was the interceptor gap. The gap was closed in the end, not only by hardware but by intelligence. What GCHQ produced in the 1970s, working with the American National Security Agency under the UK-USA agreement, was a warning system precise enough that RAF fighters could be scrambled before Soviet aircraft crossed the radar horizon. That precision came from a source the JIC guarded, even from most of Whitehall. The source was a set of Soviet military communications intercepts collected from Cyprus, from West Germany, from Norwegian territory under the joint Anglo-Norwegian arrangement signed in 1952, and from a small number of RAF Comet R.2 and later Nimrod R.1 signals intelligence aircraft based at RAF Whiten. The Nimrod R.1, 3 of which entered service with 51 Squadron in 1974, flew tracks along the northern Norwegian coast and over the Baltic approaches. Their crews, a mixture of RAF officers and GCHQ linguists, listened to Soviet air defense traffic and long-range aviation command channels. What they heard over the decade to 1984 was that Soviet bomber operations against the northern flank had become predictable in a way the Kremlin did not intend. Predictability was operational gold. It meant that when 51 Squadron reported from a flight over the Barents Sea that the 924th Guards Missile Regiment at Olenia had put crews on cockpit standby, RAF controllers at High Wycombe knew within 30 minutes that a Bear D would be airborne, that it would fly a specific reconnaissance track down the Norwegian Sea, and that it would return along an identifiable corridor. Phantom crews at Luchars could be briefed accordingly. The interception, when it came, was not a surprise. The system was tested most sharply during the crisis of November 1983, when NATO ran Exercise Able Archer 83. And according to material later provided by the SIS agent Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB reported to Moscow that the exercise might be cover for a genuine first strike. Gordievsky, run by MI6's Soviet section under John Scarlett, had walked into the British Embassy in Copenhagen in 1974 and had been slowly promoted through the KGB Residentura in London. His reporting during Able Archer, transmitted through the Century House desk and passed to Margaret Thatcher personally on November 12, 1983, warned that the Soviet General Staff had increased alert levels at long-range aviation bases, including Engels and Olenia. Thatcher's response, drafted in consultation with Foreign Secretary Geoffrey Howe and Defense Secretary Michael Heseltine, was to communicate quietly through the Washington Channel that NATO should moderate the exercise's signalling. The exercise concluded on November 11th without incident. Gordievsky's warning, the RAF's readiness posture, and the SIGINT stream from Whitehall had combined into the kind of Cold War moment that produced no headlines because it produced no crisis. By the mid-1980s, the RAF's air defense had evolved into a system quite different from the one the Javelin had inaugurated, yet recognizably continuous with it. Tornado F-3 aircraft entering service with 29 Squadron at Coningsby in 1987 carried Skyflash missiles derived from the American Sparrow and the Blue Circle radar, later replaced by the Fox Hunter after prolonged development difficulties. The airframes were faster, the radars were digital. The doctrine, however, remained: identify at long range, engage in the stern hemisphere, break away before the target could respond. That doctrine had one further test. On April 15, 1986, F-111 bombers of the United States Air Force flew from RAF Lakenheath and Upper Heyford to attack targets in Libya. Thatcher had approved the use of British bases against the advice of parts of the Foreign Office and against sustained parliamentary opposition. The Soviets, informed of the decision through the KGB Residentura in London, watched RAF air defense readiness rise across the North Sea, approaches for 48 hours around the operation. What they saw, and what the Whiten Nimrods heard them saying, was that Britain's air defense system was, in the terminology of a Soviet General Staff assessment later summarized in the Mitrokhin material, responsive within an interval we cannot exploit. The Cold War's ending, when it came, was announced not in an air defense report, but in a Foreign Office cable. On October 3, 1989, Sir Roderick Braithwaite, British ambassador in Moscow, telegraphed London with an assessment that the Warsaw Pact was structurally unable to sustain its military posture beyond 1992. The cable, released to the National Archives in 2019 as FCO 28/8215, was read by Douglas Hurd at the Foreign Office and by Thatcher at Downing Street. Neither acted immediately. What the Air Staff did, quietly, was to begin the drawdown planning that would culminate in Options for Change, announced by Tom King in the Commons on July 25, 1990. Options for Change reduced the RAF from 90,000 personnel to approximately 75,000 by 1995. Closed RAF Wildenrath and RAF Gütersloh in Germany, and cut the Tornado F.3 force from 7 squadrons to 5. The reductions were justified by the reduced threat from the Soviet Long-Range Aviation Force, which by 1990 was flying reconnaissance missions at roughly one-third the frequency of 1985. The 924th Guards at Olenia, which had generated so many of the interceptions of the previous decade, stood down to reduced readiness in September 1990. Its aircrew received notice in some cases that their unit would not exist in the form they had known within 2 years. For the men and women who had built and operated Britain's air defense across the Cold War, the ending was strange. The system had worked. The bombers had never come. The interceptions, thousands of them across 4 decades, had all been peaceful. The Javelin pilots of the late 1950s, the Lightning pilots of the 1960s, the Phantom pilots of the 1970s, and the Tornado pilots of the 1980s had all flown missions whose success was measured by the absence of what they had prepared to prevent. That was the metric Whitehall had wanted from the start. It was, in retrospect, unusual for a metric to have been met so completely. The Javelin itself had disappeared from RAF service on April 30th, 1968, when 60 Squadron flew its last operational sortie from Tengar. The type had produced no aces, won no battles that reached the newspapers, and carried no strategic weapon. Yet Sir Michael Beetham, Chief of the Air Staff from 1977 to 1982, told the RAF Historical Society in a lecture at Bracknell on March 12, 1990, that the Javelin represented the point at which British air defence acquired the capabilities that made the Cold War in the air an unequal contest. Beetham had flown Lincolns and Valiants and knew the difference between rhetoric and record. His lecture, published as RAF Historical Society Journal 8, gives the case in his own words. The Cold War ended on December 26, 1991, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Nobody in London ordered an air defence stand-down. The interceptions continued at reduced frequency throughout the 1990s and into the 21st century. The doctrine that had been written in Robb's paper of 1947 and given physical form in the Javelin of 1956 remained in modified but recognisable form, the way Britain defended its skies. The men who had flown the Flatiron in the Cyprus night, when they read the newspapers on December 27th, 1991, understood better than most what had ended and perhaps what had not.